If EQ actually worked like YouTube teaches it, your mixes would already sound professional. But here's the truth nobody tells you. Most EQ problems are not EQ problems, they are decision problems. I tried everything, EQing less, not EQing at all, but still my mixes sounded either weak and thin or just muddy. But everything changed when I stopped EQing sounds and I started EQing the rows. So in this video, I'm going to teach you 3 EQ secrets that made my mixes instantly clearer, louder, and more professional. So let's check before and after. And if you want to work with me as your music coach, check the link in the description to learn more about the program and see my client results. So let's get started with the video. Most people overcut or overboost the low end trying to clean it up, but that just kills the power and clarity. So here are the most common mistakes. Low cutting the kick and bass thinking it cleans up the sub. Boosting the sub too hard thinking it adds power, which actually just muddies everything. Over EQing the bass or the kick, destroying the sound completely. EQing the kick and bass in solo with no idea how it fits in the mix. Let's start with the most popular mistake that is ruining your low end, which is low cutting the kick and bass to clean up the bass, the sub, whatever, right? So I'm gonna play you this raw kick and bass. It sounds decent. Like, I'm not gonna say it sounds amazing, but it's definitely not too muddy. I don't really hear any big problems. But what most beginners do without even thinking, and that was my mistake as well, you usually go to the kick and to the bass, and then you do stuff like this. Okay, so let's do like this, and then same on the kick here. So this is how it sounds. And on the surface, you may think like, okay, I cleaned up this sub and now it should technically sound better. But what is really happening, you are ruining the phase of the sound. We're not gonna go too deep into that. I'm gonna keep it simplified just so I'm not confusing you. But basically, if you look at what is happening to our bass when we use a brick wall EQ like this, I'm exaggerating just to illustrate the idea. So this is the original bass line. Look at the shape. Right? It looks normal, but the moment you do a cut like this, you can see you are changing the phase of the sound, and that may destroy the relationship of the kick and the bass in worst cases, right? So then I'm gonna play you the whole thing with a kick again. And now the same thing, but without the EQ at all. Like, you see how much the shape of the kick and the bass changes when we use a brick wall EQ, like when we are low cutting like this. So don't do this. I'm gonna show you a better way to clean up your kick and bass in the next few minutes. Now, the next mistake that I see a lot of beginners do is over EQing the kick and the bass. Let's start with the kick here, for example. So we're gonna put the EQ, and again, let's start from scratch. So you may feel like this track is missing the bass, but in reality, your ears are just not trained enough to understand when it's too much and when it's just enough, like the sweet spot. So what I'm gonna do here is like, okay, let's boost the... I'm gonna do something like this, and then same on the bass line. Yeah, we have a lot of bass, and I've seen that a lot in my coaching sessions. But in reality, again, this thing is just causing you way more problems. Like, in headphones, it sounds fine, but if we compare that on... and this is without... you do not need that much bass because there's so much energy in these sub frequencies that if you boost too much in the club, it's gonna sound very muddy because that system, it amplifies the low frequencies. It has like very big subwoofer, which is the problem because in the studio, you don't hear that. So use the tips that I'm giving you right now. And the same thing applies to cutting as well. So if you're doing anything, you know, like that, like super crazy, you know, maybe something like this, right? Let's do. I think this is on the kick, right? Right. I basically just destroyed the kick, and the same on the bass, right? So I may go like. Just doing like some sort of weird stuff, right? You don't really need that much, okay? So don't do that. And really quickly, just want to show you an example with very simple processing. I almost have like nothing on my kick and the bass. So this is the kick. And this is going to be the bass. And you can see the processing is so simple, right? And it's counterintuitive. You may think like you need a lot, but that's really all I have. So keep it simple. The better approach is to think of a low end in 3 parts: sub, body, and definition. Depending on the idea of the track, you will cut and boost different parts of the spectrum. Cheat code: use a dynamic EQ on a kick plus bass, which gently removes the unwanted frequencies without killing the lower end impact. And for dynamic EQ, use bell or low shelf filter. All right, now let's get into the juicy part, and I want to walk you through the processing, the actual processing that I did to my kick and the bass. So this is the kick and the bass on the track. So on headphones, again, you may feel like we are missing the low frequencies, but it's actually not true. So we're gonna start with the kick, and this is what I have. So it may seem like it's a lot, but actually if you listen, it is very soft. So instead of low cutting, use a shelf filter with dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ is not always necessary, but I very often use it. So in this case, what I'm doing on the kick is I'm just removing a little bit of that muddiness on the kick, or like unnecessary sub, we could say. And it does not change the shape, as you can see. It doesn't affect the phase that much. So check it out. All it does, you can see, just shapes the kick a little bit without touching the phase. And then the second thing, I felt like I have a little bit too much of this area on the kick. It was like a little bit too thumpy, a little bit too, see, a little bit too muddy. So I was like, okay, let's remove that just a little bit. And you can see it just helps the kick to sit a little bit more in the mix. And if we listen with the drums, I also make sure that you always listen in the context. Okay, and now let's break down the bass line. And the bass line is going to be a lot, but let me explain. So if we listen to the original bass here, so just with the kick, it's a lot of energy. So I'm listening on real phones here, real quick. So the first thing that I did is I decided to get rid of the very sub, because like it's rumbling, it's muddy, not very necessary. And here you just have to find the sweet spot where it is cleaning up the sub without ruining the bass line. So I did, I think, around 60 here. So just listen to the clarity that this one move gave to the kick and the bass. And then another thing that I noticed on the bass line, one note, because I'm jumping an octave, is a little bit too loud. So what I did is this dynamic EQ cut on that note. And then the last thing, this dynamic EQ cut, it just cleans up the mids, like the low mids, however you want to call this. And altogether, it's really good, right? So this is before and after. And you always want to test on some sort of studio emulation or good speakers, because to me, when I'm A/Bing this, it seems like, oh, I'm killing the bass, but actually in the mix, it sounds good. So the most important thing is, how does this sound in the mix? And I'm gonna show you the full mix here. So we can go to this section. Let me remove the EQ. So you can see how much space the sub-frequencies take, and you can now understand the reason why I process the bass this way. System tip: decide who owns the sub, kick or bass. Build the other element around that choice. EQ in context, not in solo, and never try to fix something broken with EQ or processing. Clarity and loudness don't come from boosting highs, they come from mid-range. Most common mistakes: cutting too much mid-range, trying to clean up the mix. Cutting too little lows, which fights with bass and makes mix muddy. Scooping the mids out of pads, leads or claps, kills presence. Boosting highs to fix dullness, which creates harshness. And EQing in solo, not in context. Let's now talk about the instruments. So we're going to start with the first mistake, which is either not cutting enough of the low frequencies. Let's take the ARP, for example. You can see this will fight with the bass line, so we don't want that. But then a lot of people might cut a bit too much. And that just kills the body of the sound, which is also not good. So try to keep it balanced. I'll show you in the next few minutes the exact settings, what I did. And now, even if you say do the right low cut, then you might start EQing too much in the mids, which again destroys the sound. It just sounds super weird. So you want to avoid that too. And then the final thing is, you may be boosting way too much on the highs. So this is a great example because it's a very bright and aggressive sound, and if you overdo the highs, it starts to sound very harsh. So you want to be very careful with that as well. And the final problem is EQing in solo. So if you just go and you do like, and you start doing some changes to the sound, you may do like any, stuff like this, which does sound good on its own, but in the mix, it's just gonna sound very bad. So never EQ in solo. Now, another thing is on the drums. So with the drums, it's really easy to overdo. And one of the most popular mistakes that I see people do, like including my clients as well, what I've seen in the coaching sessions is cutting way too much low end on the drums. So if you just do like this, you're just destroying the body of the drums. So even though drums are mostly high frequency instruments, it's still not necessary to cut too much. Honestly, I'm keeping quite a lot of low frequencies on the drums, like unless I actually have some mud. So something like that is good. And you can see I'm not even touching the hi-hats because they already sound good. And this is one of the biggest mind fucks when it comes to EQ. You may often feel like you need to fix something, like you need to EQ just because, but in reality, sometimes you don't. And that's okay, right? And the same thing on the claps too, right? So if we take the clap, so this is the EQ that I have, and this is without. So again, if you cut a bit too much here, it just starts to sound thin. and the mix just loses its power. Here's a better approach. Use EQ for subtle shaping, not fixing. Use analog style EQs to add tone and vibe without surgical harshness. Use dynamic EQ to tame resonances without killing musicality. Don't EQ in solo, but listen in context and fix levels first, then shape the tone. Also try EQing groups, but be careful. All right, so let's break down the proper settings for the ARP synth. I'm gonna start with the dynamic EQ. So this one is really simple. If we listen with the kick and with the bass, all I'm really doing here is just filtering unnecessary lows. So in the previous example, it was a bit too muddy, but in this case, if you use a dynamic EQ, fighting with the bass, but like this. And I like dynamic EQ because it's working only when it's needed. So it's not always like cutting. So very often I would choose a dynamic EQ cut instead of just the regular one. So it just keeps the sound more natural. Okay, this is the thing number one, really simple. And then the next thing is going to be this analog style EQ. You can use any you want. This one is from Analog Obsession, really good free plugins, by the way. So if you want to download, check out the website. Okay, so let's do before and after. This is before. Not bad, right? But then if we enable this one, I'm boosting a little bit on the highs. Actually going to reduce that a little bit. Then boosting a little bit on 0.7, so that's 700, just for the mids. Cutting a little bit on 300, so you can see I'm doing another cut, and then a little bit on 200. So this one is just not as surgical, it's not as precise, so this is like a soft kind of shaping tool. The difference is kind of subtle. I'm not going to say it's really big, so just check out on... and without. So difference is pretty subtle, but in the mix, it's gonna be very audible, especially when other instruments are playing, because you're gonna apply similar principles to every sound, and then it's gonna compound. You're gonna get a very nice and clean mix. And another thing that I want to talk about is the group EQ. So here, I just want to warn you, do not try to copy my settings here because every mix is different. And I was listening to everything critically and I thought like, okay, so these are the settings that I want for my group channel with all the synthesizers. So let's start without first. So you can see this one, this band, it just filters the unnecessary mids. But you want to be very careful because if you do too much, you are killing the sound. But if you don't do enough, then it's going to sound muddy. So it's always about the sweet spot, like finding that perfect amount. And you can see it reacts only when it's really needed. So that's it. But one of the important cuts is this low shelf as well. So still, like, it filters just a little bit, like not too much. I'm not going like with a low cut, just like this, right? Because then I'm gonna ruin the sound. So this is like a softer approach. And that's pretty much it. So just a little bit of shaping during every step, individual sounds and groups. When two elements fight for space, use sidechain EQ so one ducks the other only when needed. That gives you instant clarity without over EQing either sound. Ask, which sounds owns the mid-range in this section? EQ the rest to support that. And if it sounds great soloed, but bad in context, you are either EQing wrong or your arrangement is just messed up, and you cannot fix that with dynamic sidechain EQ. Okay, now let's talk about the sidechain dynamic EQ because this is a pretty new technology, but it does magic to your mixes. So we have this arpeggio. And then we have other synth sounds that are in the same spectrum, or they sound somewhat similar. So what I did here is I applied this plugin called Track Spacer. You can apply Soothe, or you can just Google, like, there are free plugins like that. So it doesn't matter what you use. So you can see when the synths are playing, they are ducking the arpeggio. Let's use the studio speakers for a sec. So this is with. And this is without. And just one more time, I'm gonna exaggerate and reduce the loudness just a little bit for more contrast. So you can see by doing like this, you create more separation and more clarity in your mix. But one important thing, don't ever try to fix bad arrangement with this, because a lot of times people think like, oh, I can just sidechain one element to another and then it's gonna magically make my mixes better. No, it unfortunately doesn't work like that. You need to have good arrangement. And then another example, since the arpeggio is a pretty important element, it's like the driving element of this track, what I did is I sidechained the arpeggio to my bass line, but just from 300 until like 1000, just the mids area. I'm not touching the sub, not touching the highs, although like we could honestly until 2K like easily. So now the bass is being ducked by the arpeggio. So if you check it out, so the bass is still present, it's still clean, but just because this plugin is working, the arpeggio is ducking the bass, and we have a very nice separation. So use this tool wisely. The mix bus is not where you fix problems. It's where you shape and finish the tone. Common mistakes: over EQing on the master, low coding at 30 Hz to tighten the mix or clean the bass, and boosting highs for fake loudness, which introduces harshness. A better approach here is to use Portex style EQ for gentle tone curves, subtle bell cuts or boost for clarity or warmth, stereo widening EQs only on highs, which keeps lows centered, and gentle dynamic EQ to control sub if needed. All right, and now let's talk about the last thing, which will be the master EQ. So number one, I just want to show you the mix without any EQ at all. So this is how it sounds. Like, not bad, but could be a little bit better. It's a little bit too boomy, so let me apply these two. So when you do a little bit of EQ on the master channel, or like on the mix bus, it can do magic. So let's start with the number one. So I often would reduce the sub just a little bit, even though like it looks like I'm cutting a lot, because this is a low shelf, it's not a low cut. It is not gonna ruin the bass, but just make sure you don't do too much. So you can try just a little bit more and then dial back when you feel like it's enough. So in this case, let's just disable those. Start with something like, and you can see it's just barely touching the sub. So maybe from here. Then another one, the next EQ band is this dynamic EQ cut. I felt like if I reduce a little bit here, it's gonna make the mix cleaner. Or like maybe I just didn't like that frequency again. That's what I felt for this specific mix. Again, doesn't mean that you should always do this to your mixes. Sometimes I don't do any EQ at all and it still sounds good. Sometimes I do quite a lot, so you know, just be critical. Honestly, I wouldn't even boost it. Actually, quite good. Then another one is on the mid. This is where the clarity sits. Then we have another one here. So this is just for the highs. But here, I felt like it's a little bit too much, so we're going to be really careful with this. And then just on the highs. One more time without. So this is the final rebalancing, and it's just a bit. You see, like 2.2, like it's fine. Doesn't really do that much. Okay, and then another thing is going to be the pull tick. This is the same analog EQ that I showed you when I was EQing the instruments. And in this case, I am cutting a little bit on 300, boosting a little bit on 1.5, boosting just a little bit on the highs, and 30 hertz here for like adding a bit more bass. So I often, you can see throughout the mixing process, I might cut the sub on the kick and the bass and then bring back a little bit to compensate for that. But now it's going to be like a clean bass. So check with the pull tick. Something like this is cool. You can also cut and boost at the same time. This is like the beauty of this EQ actually. Yeah, 1.5 is cool. And let me just reduce the... Do you have the filter here? No. And you can hear it sounds really good. And without these two, really good, right? Cheat code. Think of mix-buzz EQ like a photo filter. Small changes that shift the whole tone. 1 or 2 dB max. Tiny moves, big results. But it can be a little bit less, can be a little bit more. So just make sure you listen in the context with your mix. If it makes it better, then it's fine to do it. System tip. Master EQ only works if the mix is already balanced. You can shape low end here, but not fix it. So avoid using master EQ to rescue a bad mix. Here's how I use EQ in my tracks. Build from the ground up. Don't EQ in isolation. Always think about what role the sound plays and EQ to do that job better. So I start with the kick and the bass, EQ that first, then with the instruments, drums, and then the mix buzz. So that's the logic. So now you understand the full system, how to properly EQ. But how do you actually get loud, clear, and punchy mixes? In the next video here, I'm going to teach you that. So click here and watch this video next.